Welcome to People's University and the series we're calling Climate Change, Is There Still Hope, and various other names. If you wouldn't mind turning your cell phones off if you have one on, I'd appreciate it. This Tuesday, just a few announcements before I introduce our guest tonight. On the 29th, Bob Gaudio will be here, the troubadour. He'll be playing songs in tribute to the Beatles in memory of their last concert, which I believe was 50 years ago to the day that he'll be playing. That same week on Thursday, this gentleman, Mike Florio, who's from Wheeling, and now he's a big shot NBC NFL analyst, but he wrote this book called Father of Mine about his experiences as a kid growing up with, let's say, mob types here in Wheeling. So that'll be the 31st at noon. I have to remember to take these with. We have these books for $15, only $15. If you're interested, send me an email or see me after class. On the 5th of September, we'll be doing a panel discussion of this book called Here, which is a graphic novel set in one space over millions of years, what happens in that one space. And it's part of our Wheeling Reads series. We have a really good panel assembled for that. Look for it in the brochure. Next Thursday, Ember Morrissey will be here from WVU, who's an associate professor of environmental microbiology. And her topic will be the long, slow march of progress toward a greener future for West Virginia. In the final class, excuse me, we hopefully inspired by Generation Z and the actions they've taken. We have Mr. Zane Murray, who's 11 years old, here from Wheeling, and he'll be on a Zoom call with Rob Below, who's the lawyer. If you saw the movie Dark River, Mark Ruffalo played him, and he'll be on our screen and talking to Zane, because Zane did an interview of him and has done quite a bit of work against forever chemicals. And we've added to that program another young man named Edgar McGregor, and he is the little brother of Ellery McGregor, who works here in marketing. But he's at San Jose State, and he's got like 44,000 Twitter followers, so we're hoping to get a little bump in the live stream broadcast from that. But he's done a lot of work just cleaning up trash in the California area, so he'll tell you about that. Now, this series is also part of the Wheeling Reads project, and this is the book, Heat and Light. How many have read this book? How many are reading the book? How many will have it read before the program? All right. Jennifer will be here on September 9th to talk about her book at 4 p.m. We also have workshops that day in poetry, ekphrastic art, which simply means art inspired by the book, and young adult writing. So check that out. The brochures are on your table again. We have the night before, we have a pub crawl, a literary pub crawl, in which you'll meet 4 writers from Wheeling, and then have a beer after each one. Maybe just have one beer and listen to 4 writers. It's up to you, you're adults. But there'll be a hip-hop poetry slam at Towngate after, if you're interested in that, after the pub crawl on the 8th of September. Our instructor this evening is going to tell us, as you can see, about harnessing nature to slow climate change. His name is Eddie Brzostek. He's an associate professor of biology at WVU, and his research uses experiments and observations to examine how forests and agroecosystems store carbon, which you've learned in the past 2 classes is very important fact, and he uses this information to develop mathematical models that predict the response of carbon storage in these systems to future climate change. He received his BA in Earth Science from Boston University and then his doctoral degree in biology at Boston University in 2012. Here is Dr. Eddie Brzostek.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So, like Sean said, I'm Dr. Eddie Brzostek. I don't go by doctor, I'm just Eddie. I've been at West Virginia University since about 2015, and so I've been in West Virginia 8 years. I really love it. I put up some pictures of some of my favorite places in West Virginia on this title slide. So in the middle you can see Lindy Point from Blackwater Falls. Right next to that is a picture of Elk Lick Run, which is in the Furno Experimental Forest in Parsons, West Virginia. And then I had to add in a couple from other places. So the one on the forest on the other side is a Douglas fir forest in near Portland, Oregon. And then the other one over here is my student digging a hole in Illinois, where we were measuring soil carbon down to really deep depths. And so, like Sean said, I'm basically an ecosystem ecologist. So I'm really interested in all this stuff that you can see on this slide here. And you might look at that and be like, that just looks like a mess, but that's all really cool stuff to me. You have mycorrhizal fungi. These are helper fungi that help roots get nutrients from the soil. You have the roots. You have decomposer fungi that are fighting with the mycorrhizal fungi, trying to get nutrients and resources from the soil. And so what I do is try to make sense of all of this so that we can better predict how ecosystems, forests, and also agricultural systems will respond to climate change in the future. And so with that lens, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of my knowledge of how we can harness natural ecosystems to slow climate change. And so the first thing I wanted to do today is just talk broadly about how we can reduce carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And I'm sure you've seen this graph 1,000 times, but this is the Mauna Loa curve. And it's showing you the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere going from a while back to now. You can see that there's a broad increase over time. And what we're really interested is in bending that curve, right? Because carbon dioxide is tightly coupled to temperature on the globe. And so what I'm going to do then is go through a number of different natural climate solutions, including bioenergy and what they call regenerative agriculture. And then I'm going to talk about how we can manage forests and also reforest areas so that we can store more carbon in these areas. I'm also going to talk a little bit about wetlands. I'm not a wetland person, so you're going to be, if you're a really wetland enthusiast, you're going to be a little sad that there's only 3 slides on that. And then I'm also going to end with some work we did as part of the West Virginia University Bridge Initiative. This is a science and technology policy initiative at WVU. And what we were trying to do is make a policymaker's guide for carbon dioxide removal in West Virginia. So what are some of the potential economic opportunities for West Virginia to be a leader in carbon dioxide removal? And so I'm going to walk through some of that as well. All right, so before I go whole hog into natural climate solutions, I just want to start off with the best way to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is to reduce emissions. We're not going to be able to natural climate solution or engineer our way out of this. We're going to have to reduce emissions. But that being said, these natural climate solutions can be an important part of the solution. They're not going to be 90% of it. They might be 10 or 20% of it. And so I just have a couple of important climate agreements up here. There's a Paris Climate Accord that the US is a part of, where we pledge to reduce our emissions to keep warming to 2 degrees C. And then there was also a recent, another meeting in Glasgow in 2021 where we reaffirmed some of these pledges and discussed actual ways we're going to get to these targets. All right. So what I'm showing you here is a really old, well, it's not a really old paper. It's from 2004. And it was this paper done by Steve Bacala, who's at Princeton University. He's a real big shot. He's such a big shot that he walks around at meetings wearing socks with sandals, and he can get away with it. And so what he did is he had this idea that you could have these different, so here's carbon dioxide concentrations if we did nothing, and then if we had these, we can kind of break down what we need to do to reduce them into these stabilization triangles or wedges. And he went through and talked about what some of these wedges are, and the thing was, this is in 2004, and all these solutions were technologically feasible. There was no great moonshot or shot that had to happen for us to do this. And so some of them are things like increasing energy efficiency. Some of them were doing carbon capture and storage at energy plants. So this is where you'd have a coal-fired power plant, you'd capture the CO2 coming out of the smokestack, and then you directly inject it underground into a geologic reservoir, where hopefully it would stay for at least a couple hundred years. But then he also identified some different energy sources like nuclear, wind, solar, those things. But then he also finally went to natural climate solutions. So things like reducing deforestation, planting more trees, managing our land better, and also managing our agricultural systems better. And so I'm going to walk through some of these for you as we keep moving forward here. And again, I want to say that when you look at all those triangles, all those wedges to stabilize the climate, natural climate solutions are only going to be about 10 or 20%. We're not going to be able to plant 3 trillion trees and keep burning fossil fuels. And that's sort of, I'm really belaboring this point, and I apologize, but that's what this graph is doing too. So it's just showing you, here's our emissions and what we would do if we kept going on our natural way. Here's what we'd have to do to reduce emissions, and then you can see that these natural climate solutions are just going to be part of that solution. All right, I need a drink of water. All right, so now we're going to jump into all these solutions. After I burned in your brain that we can't just natural climate solution our way out of it, but they are important. So one thing that people have been looking at for at least a couple decades is bioenergy. And bioenergy is basically growing crops or also sometimes trees that you use their biomass to create fuels. And so the idea is that the plant takes up the carbon dioxide, it puts it into its biomass. You then convert that biomass into a fuel or something else that you can run a car or run a power plant. And it's a carbon neutral fuel because the carbon coming in is coming from the atmosphere and the carbon coming out is just what the plant took up. And so here I'm showing you a number of different examples of bioenergy, and a lot of these are from work that I do as part of the Center for Advanced Biofuels and Bioproducts Innovation, which is it's actually funded by your tax dollars, thank you. It's funded by the Department of Energy. And we work with people out in Illinois to look at, can we grow these bioenergy crops so that we can produce a fuel while at the same time maybe also enhancing carbon storage in the ecosystem. So it's kind of a win-win. You get a fuel, and then you're also storing carbon in the soil at the same time. And so here I'm just showing you a couple of these different plants. They're all really crazy. So this is switchgrass. Actually, sorry, this is miscanthus. This is switchgrass. This is actually a former WVU graduate student, Mark Burnham. He's holding a stalk of energy sorghum. You see how tall that thing grows? It grows like crazy. This is one of the harvesters harvesting some miscanthus, and again, another picture of miscanthus. And the one thing with all these bioenergy grasses is they grow really fast. You don't have to till the land, so you don't have to go through and plow, because plowing actually releases a lot of the carbon that's left in the soil, because when you churn up the soil, you make the microbes really happy. They eat everything, and it all blows off. And so these are really good because you don't have to till the soil. They're perennial, so they come back every year. You can cut them down, make your biofuel, and then they'll just regrow the next year. And the other good thing about them is that they use a lot less nutrients than corn or soybeans or those things. A lot of these things are really adept at going and getting the nutrients from the soil, or they also make friends with different bacteria that can get that nitrogen from the atmosphere. And you might not think you use bioenergy, but almost all of us, unless you have an electric car, you're using bioenergy. You have 10% ethanol in your gas. It's mandated by the Renewable Fuel Standard. And so we're already using ethanol, corn ethanol, as an energy solution in the United States. The one problem with that is that corn ethanol is not carbon, it doesn't meet that awesome thing that we think with bioenergy. It's actually not carbon neutral. And so typically when you make corn ethanol, you're only 75% effective at, so 100% of the carbon comes into the corn, but then you end up releasing 125% when you end up burning the fuel. So it's not totally carbon neutral. You're still releasing carbon when you're making corn ethanol. And then there's also the fact that corn is really bad for water quality because you dump a lot of fertilizer on it and it runs into the river, and then you get the anoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico where all the fish die. So anyway, what we want to do is use these perennial grasses because they might be a win-win, like I was saying. So things like miscanthus, switchgrass, reed canary grass, you're able to grow these things on marginal lands. So there's a lot of folks in West Virginia and other researchers at WVU who are growing these perennial grasses on abandoned minelands because these things can grow on abandoned minelands. They don't care that the soil is depleted. They don't care that it's all crushed. It's basically crushed rock sitting there. So they're really good at growing on these infertile lands. Again, you don't have to till the land or plow the land, so it reduces those soil carbon losses. And there's a lot of evidence that these perennial grasses have really deep roots, and those deep roots act as a conduit for carbon to go into the soil. So you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, the deep roots are sending the carbon down into the soil. And we have evidence from Illinois where they've had miscanthus planted for over 15 years, and miscanthus has way higher soil carbon than the traditional corn soil rotations that they do. And that's what I'm showing you on this graph. And I apologize because it's hard to see. But what you're looking at here is just a graph of carbon storage from 2009 to 2013 out in Illinois. And the way they measured this is actually pretty cool. It's called eddy covariance. And they use technology that was designed by the Defense Department to guide missiles and planes. So what they do is they have what is called a sonic anemometer. It has 3 prongs. It sends a sound pulse from each of the prongs, and it can measure wind speed and direction about 60 times a second, or at 60 hertz frequency. And so you know where the wind is coming from. And when wind goes over a rough canopy, it actually eddies, does these little loops. And so what that sonic anemometer can tell you is when the wind is going into the canopy and when it's coming out. And so you can measure the CO2 of when it's coming in and the CO2 of when it's coming out. And you can see how much is actually staying there. And so the other thing that's terrible about this graph that was made by atmospheric chemists is they make carbon staying in the ecosystem negative because anything going out of the atmosphere is a negative flux because they're screwy atmospheric chemists. But you can see that over time, if you look at the miscanthus, which is in green, you can see that over time it keeps getting more and more negative, taking up more and more carbon. And that carbon is sticking in the ecosystem over time. And this is one of the gold standards we have for measuring carbon uptake by an ecosystem. These are really expensive toys. They're not cheap, and they break a lot. So this is really good data showing that these perennial grasses are really good at storing carbon in soils. So we're really good at growing the biomass. We do a really good job at growing biomass. We still have a big problem of converting that biomass into fuels. And so there's been decades of research. The thing that is in plants is stuff called lignin and cellulose. And that lignin and cellulose is a structural component of the plant. And that stuff is really hard to break down. Microbes can't eat it. You have to have these crazy enzymatic reactions to try to break that stuff down and make it into a fuel. And so the place that I'm working at the Center for Advanced Biofuels and Bioproducts Innovation, what we're trying to do, and this is not what I do, but some of my colleagues there, what they try to do is they're trying to genetically engineer plants so they send less of their carbon to these structural components and instead make more oils. So the idea is that the plant is the factory. You don't have to worry about converting anything. The plant is going to make an oil, or it's going to make that product that you want. And this is important, even if we have to reduce emissions for things, there's still going to be stuff like jet aviation, long-haul trucking that we're going to need. We're still going to need liquid fuels for. And so the idea, and then the other thing is that you might not realize it, but a lot of stuff that you use every day comes from oil and petroleum. So there's also a lot of chemical compounds that we're going to need to be able to replace using these biofuels. And then the only other thing is that they're also going to try and, because when you start screwing with a plant and try to make it make more oils, they've done this, the plant grows up and then it falls over. And so they're working on trying to make sure that you can still get the same yield, so the plant grows as tall as the original plant does, but it's also resilient to drought, high temperatures, and it also gives you that biomass you need so that you can get a productive biofuel. All right. So there's also a way that we can couple bioenergy with what I was talking about, which is carbon capture and storage. So what you're looking at here is, if you look, you got your biomass, you have your plant. I mean, you wouldn't even have to make a fuel, you could just burn this stuff. Although there's some problems with pollution, particularly organic matter stuff. If anybody's been dealing with wildfire smoke, it's not real fun. But what you can do is you can burn that stuff in a plant, and then you can inject it into these reservoirs, into these places where that carbon dioxide will stay locked up. And we've already been pumping carbon dioxide into underground because they use it for enhanced oil capture. So if you can't get oil out of a well, a lot of times you'll pump CO2 down the well so that the oil will start coming back up. So we know this works. The one problem is wondering how long it will be there. So it's not forever, and it might just be kicking that can down the road. So if 300-400 years may not seem like a long time, but people 300-400 years ago might be mad at us that we pumped a lot of carbon dioxide into the ground. But the good thing about this bioenergy carbon capture and storage is that it's one of the few things that we have that actually gives us negative emissions. So you're going to be making energy and sequestering carbon dioxide at the same time, because you're going to grow a plant, it's going to take up all that carbon dioxide, you're going to burn it, you're going to capture the CO2 and inject it underground. So this graph you're looking at here is just, I know it's hard to see, but it's just different scenarios of what kind of energy sources could we use. So like if we don't use BECCS, we're going to be burning a lot less fossil fuels. But if we do use this bioenergy carbon capture and storage, you can still burn fossil fuels and kind of ease that transition into renewable energies. And this is one of the few ways that you can generate energy with negative emissions. Because even wind power, yes, you're displacing fossil fuel emissions, but you're not actually sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I kind of foreshadowed this a little bit. So most of the scenarios like if you go back here and you see that one where it has the big green bar going down all the way to the right, where they do a lot of this bioenergy carbon capture and storage. Well, one of the problems is you have a lot of substantial land conversion. And so we have to balance the land that we need to feed people, the land that we could use for bioenergy, and also the land we need to conserve because we need to conserve biodiversity and different ecosystems of the earth. And so there's that balancing energy production with food production. And then again, I talked about this. There's the idea that, maybe we're just pushing the can down the road and our great-great-great-great-grandchildren would be mad we did this. All right. So our next solution is regenerative agriculture. And so here, this is a recent paper that shows a bunch of different regenerative agriculture solutions and kind of what their climate mitigation potential is. I'm going to walk through some of these. So one potential solution is biochar. So this is where you would burn plant biomass, and you burn at really high temperatures in the absence of oxygen. And what this leads to is a form of carbon that's really hard to break down by microbes in the soil. And so you can mix this stuff in the soil and it'll sequester carbon for a very long time. There's actually companies that are doing this. The other thing we need to think about in agriculture, and one of the biggest impacts of agriculture on climate change, is methane emissions, so cow burps. And so we need to think about reducing cow burps. And there's a textbook that we use in class, and the guy who wrote it actually calculated the methane flux of cow flatulence as well. So that's in there as well. You got cow farts, cow burps, you want to reduce both of those. And so one of the ways to do this is to try to engineer their feed and also engineer their gut microbes so they don't produce as much methane. And then another really important solution is also just planting cover crops. So if you go past an agricultural field, you'll see that a lot of times in the winter there's nothing on it, right? So it's just a barren land. And that's okay, but what can happen is you can get wind and soil erosion. So the microbes aren't eating the carbon in the soil, You're just sending the carbon just leaving the system by erosion into waterways, and then it gets released when it gets into bigger waterways. So there's a lot of research where people are looking at, okay, if we plant a different cover crop here, will that help us keep carbon in the system? And then this last picture over here on this side is just a picture of no-till agriculture. And my father was a USDA federal employee for a long time, and he worked for the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And I remember growing up, he would practice his talks on the wall because he had his old slide projector. You know, you had to click in, you had to put his slides in there. And he'd be talking to farmers about no-till farming. And what this is, instead of plowing the land, you use disc to cut into that residue layer so that you can put the soil in there without disrupting that soil structure, making it a microbe party where they're really happy because everything's broken up. And then you get those big carbon losses. And so no-till agriculture is also a way that if we promote more of this, we can keep carbon in farm ecosystems. And something that's really taken off in the last couple of years is that these practices people are trying to make money off this stuff. And there's a huge burgeoning market. There's startups all over the place. I've sort of kind of thought about the idea of starting a startup company myself. I haven't gotten there yet. And so this is one that's called IndigoA. And what they do is they will go to farmers and help them develop a management strategy to help them increase the carbon storage of their farm. And then they will sample the soils to figure out, okay, how much carbon did you have in it at time point 1? And then they'll go back later and say, how much carbon did you have in it at time point 5 years from now? The other thing they do is they also use predictive models. So they use mathematical models to predict, okay, if this farmer does this on his land, he could expect to have this much carbon in 20 years. And so then they'll certify that, they'll bundle it together, and then they'll sell it. And a lot of big companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Coca-Cola, a lot of them are buying these carbon credits from farmers because they want to offset their emissions. You ever get a box from Amazon and it says this box is offset, the cart to storage, that's where this is coming from. The other thing besides companies trying to offset their carbon emissions, companies are also trying to reduce the carbon intensity of their supply chains. So Coca-Cola is trying to do more sustainable sugarcane farming in Brazil. Some of the big ag companies are trying to figure out how to design better feeds for their chickens, their cows, because I think which is a good thing is that the corporations are realizing that their supply chains are threatened by climate change, and anything they can do to help it is going to keep their bottom line nice and happy. This one is one of my favorite. So this is a company called LoanBio. And this group got it says 100 million. They've actually gotten $150 million from Wall Street for a strategy where they're going to coat grass species, like coat agricultural seeds with a microbe that they say increases carbon storage. And so what the actual microbe that they're putting on there is mycorrhizal fungi. These are helper fungi that help the plant get nutrients, and then the plant sends them carbon in exchange. And a lot of these helper fungi are kind of gooey. And so that goo binds together soils, it makes big aggregates, and it enhances the soil carbon because the microbes can't get in to break up the stuff that's in a big ball of soil, a big clump of soil. And so I've been thinking about coding a seed myself and trying to make $200 million and not being a professor anymore. I keep thinking that thing's going to go. All right. So all of these things are really promising, but there's still a lot of issues that are dealing with verifying whether the carbon you say is in the ecosystem is actually there. And one of the big things, and I'm showing this picture again, is that it's really hard to measure changes in soil carbon. You could have a farm field, you can go out on a farm field and find an area the size of the table, and you can measure carbon at this corner and measure carbon at that corner, and they could be different by 50%. And so you have to sample like crazy, and it leads to a lot of costs because if you're trying to sell these carbon credits, you also have to verify that they actually exist. You have to balance how much do I have to sample the soil to actually show that this carbon is increased. so that I can sell my carbon credit to Amazon or Google. And so there's a lot of folks working on different technologies, looking at shining light at a soil. Can you tell how much carbon it has in it? Can you use satellites to tell how much carbon is in the soil? There's a lot of also growth in that area of venture capital. The other thing is that with a lot of these carbon credit strategies, they get what's the word I'm trying to criticized. They get criticized for maybe they're not actually storing carbon, because what you have to do is you have to show that what you're doing is increasing carbon from a stable baseline. And so you have to have additionality. You have to show that, okay, if I did nothing, my carbon would be this, and I do no-till farming and a cover crop, my carbon will be that. And there's a lot of problems with, sometimes they set that baseline really low so they can sell more carbon credits. And then the final thing that we're still tweaking is most companies and myself use mathematical predictive models to say, okay, this is how much carbon this ecosystem will have in the future. And these are not perfect, I will admit that myself. We still have a lot of uncertainty. And you can see why we have a lot of uncertainty if you just look at that picture. Soil is one of the most complex environments on Earth. You have physical, meaning biological, you have particles, you have fungi, you have bacteria, you have over 4,000 species of microbes in a single gram of soil. It's really difficult to predict what that soil is going to do in the future. But we are trying, and your tax dollars are helping us improve that predictive power. And so people are trying to solve this, so there are also startup companies. This is one called the Soil Inventory Project. One of my current graduate students worked on this project. What they did is they were partnering with Al Gore, so they're working on his farm in Tennessee. They sampled the crap out of it, and they were trying to establish that stable baseline of carbon, and then Al Gore did all these regenerative agricultural practices, and they're going back to see if they can measure that increase. And at the same time, they're trying to develop a tool where farmers can go out and just take the sample and send it to a lab, and they can get reproducible results. And so they've recently gotten $20 million from the USDA to help burgeon this effort. All right, so this is more near and dear to my heart. So the next natural climate solution is enhancing forest carbon. And you can see if you look at this graph here, you can see that most of these values are way over here. Forests are way better at storing carbon than agricultural ecosystems. And some of the ways we can do this is simply through reforestation. There's a lot of areas where trees have been cut down and they haven't been replanted. We can go plant trees grow, they store carbon in the wood, and they're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. The other thing we can do is avoid deforestation. So there's a lot of projects in tropical forests where companies are selling these carbon credits so that they don't cut down the tropical rainforest, so we preserve that rainforest. And then the other thing you can do is also improve your forest management. So in West Virginia, the typical forest management, and if anybody's in the forest industry, raise your hand so I don't get in trouble. Nobody's in the forest industry. Okay. So typically what they do is what is called high grading. They go into the landscape, they look for the most valuable trees, and they cut them down. Right? With no real thought about what is the forest going to look like 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And so if you have a sustainable forest management plan where you think about, okay, what's this forest going to look like in 30, 40, 50, 60 years? You cut accordingly, you maintain a good species base so that you can keep that forest taking up carbon into the future. All right. And those are the main ones I'm going to talk about. And so this was a big paper that came out in Nature. It was called the Global Tree Restoration Potential. And what you're looking at here is what they did is they went all over the world and they figured out, okay, where we had forests in the past and where can we put forests in the future? And so they used remote sensing to say, okay, this is where we had forests. And then they looked at climate conditions that would support forests now, and they figured out, okay, if we look at this, we can say there's about 1 billion hectares of the Earth's land surface where we could plant trees and they would thrive. And this would be a monumental effort. But they also thought that this would store 205 gigatons of carbon. That's a lot of carbon. It's like 20 or 30% of what we've emitted over the last 150 years. This paper got a lot of positive press, and it got a lot of negative press. One of the reasons it got a lot of negative press is that the scientists like me went at it and they thought, okay, this is probably an overestimate because there's problems with actually establishing those trees and getting them to grow. And the other thing that scientists were a little worried about with this is that it provided an excuse to not reduce emissions. This doesn't mean that this isn't a viable strategy, it's just that it's not going to solve everything. And recently, even our Congress is on board. So I don't know if folks saw this story, but the House Republicans recently said they were going to plant 1 trillion trees. And they neglected to realize that would, if they were going to plant 1 trillion trees, that would be all of the continental US, that they would need the land area to do it. And so what we want to do is be able to do these reforestation projects, but also not give an excuse to folks to keep burning fossil fuels like they are now. So they're important, but we also don't want to give folks an excuse. And so that's just planting trees where there weren't any trees. And there's a lot of folks trying to plant trees on abandoned mine lands, along with bioenergy crops in West Virginia. Because if you can get those trees in a place where there wasn't trees before, they're going to store a lot of carbon. But the other thing folks are doing is trying to do this improved forest management that I was talking about. And so if you look at this graph right here, you can see on this is forest, this is not of carbon in the forest. This yellow line is business as usual land management in West Virginia. And so you can see that they're harvesting every 7-8 years. It leads to a forest that isn't super happy and one that's not taking up a lot of carbon. If you just defer your rotation cycle, and instead of harvesting more frequently, you harvest every 20 years, the ecosystem stores a lot more carbon, and even in that 40-year window, you're able to harvest your forest and make some money. And you also get credit for, so if you take wood from your lands and they make a table out of it, and that table is going to last 100 years, they also include that carbon dioxide storage in your monetary incentive. And so the good thing about this is that this project is, this graph actually took from the Nature Conservancy. And what they're trying to do is they have this American Family Forest Program, Family Forest Carbon Program, sorry. And what they're trying to do is get small landowners, people who own anywhere between 40 and 100 acres enrolled, so that they can do sustainable forest management and also store carbon in their land at the same time. And then they can also make some money while they're doing it. And there's 2 places where you can sell these carbon credits. One is the voluntary market, so that's what I was talking about, like Amazon, Google, Microsoft. And then the other is the compliance market. So there are certain states like California, Washington, I think Oregon might be online now, where they have, they've started cap and trade. So basically they're lowering their emissions sequentially every year. And if you're a power plant, you can either reduce your carbon emissions, or you can buy carbon credits to offset that. And so we actually have a ton of carbon credit projects in West Virginia. It's almost 28 million carbon credits have been sold in West Virginia. They're about $10 to $20 a piece. You're talking anywhere from $300 to $600 million. And most of that has gone to large land holding corporations. So it's not your everyday Joe. And that's why the Nature Conservancy and other organizations are trying to get other people into this market. All right, so how does this work? So this is a graph that my postdoc, Brooke Eastman, put together as part of the bridge. And so what you do is you go and you get a forest management plan. And they tell you, okay, this is how you're going to manage your forest to store more carbon in it and do it sustainably. You then are able to sell those carbon credits to anyone, but typically you'd be in a program, so you'd be selling them to Microsoft or Google. And then you have to have somebody come in and verify that your forest is actually taking up this carbon. And then businesses like Coca-Cola or other things can buy these to offset their emissions. All right, so there's a couple of issues, and there's been a lot of press recently about, are these credits real? And I know this is hard to see, but what it says is that, it's an article in The Guardian, and it says more than 90% of rainforest carbon offsets by biggest certifier are worthless, analysis shows. And I think the CEO of that company resigned pretty quickly right after this article came out. But the reason for this is that they were, particularly in tropical rainforests, you have to say that they're going to cut it. So we're going to protect this land from deforestation. And what they were doing was protecting land that wasn't going to be cut. And the other thing is that a lot of the models that they use for projecting how fast a tree is going to grow also doesn't include climate change in them. So it doesn't take into account it might get warmer, there might be more droughts. And so there's also some uncertainty in that. But again, there's also efforts to do this better. And I talked a little bit about this in the slide before, but this is from the website of the Family Forest Carbon Program. And here what they're trying to do is increase the integrity of these credits. And they're using a pretty novel solution. And so, like I said, so you have to have a baseline, and then what you're going to do has to be additional carbon storage off what if you did nothing. And so one way to cheat is to make the baseline really low, right? And so what the Family Forest Carbon Program does is they use your tax dollars fund the U.S. Forest Service. They have this network of plots all over the United States where they measure forest productivity. There's something like 150,000 of these plots. And they go out and they measure them every 5 or 10 years. And the other thing that's cool about it is the plots are secret. Only certain people in the U.S. Forest Service know where they are. So I can't, if I want to work on these plots, I have to like talk to the director, like where are these things? And I have to have a really valid reason. So they're trying to protect the landowners. And so what they do is they take your little plot of land, your 40 acres, and they look around the general area and they try to find some of these Forest Service plots that are similar. And they use those to establish the baseline. And so those are getting business as usual management. Yours won't, and yours will diverge and have more carbon sequestration. And so that's, again, they're just showing you that graph. Here's, I know it's really small. This is bad management, good management, you get more carbon. All right, so this is the one if you're a wetland enthusiast, I apologize. But wetlands are really important. So wetlands, they recently coined this term blue carbon because wetlands are really efficient at storing carbon in their sediments. Has anybody ever walked through a wetland? It's swampy, it's mucky, it's gross. Well, that's all pure, beautiful black carbon gold. And so there's a lot of efforts to go out and restore wetlands. So whether you reflood lands, whether you protect these wetlands. So there's efforts to do coastal wetlands like mangroves, but there's also efforts to do inland wetlands like we have here in West Virginia. Because if you can restore those wetlands, you can get a lot of carbon that's sticking in there. And this is another paper that recently came out just showing if you look at where do we have wetlands and where have we lost them. And this top one is just showing you that this is the percent of wetland carbon or wetland ecosystems that were lost since 1700. And you see there's a lot of places used to be swamp. Like there's a huge swamp in Ohio. There's huge swamps down in the south, and we've drained them for agriculture. So there's a potential to reflood these wetlands. I mean, you're not going to want to do all of it because you still got to feed people, but there's a potential to restore these wetlands and enhance carbon storage. All right. So the last little bit of the talk here, I just want to talk about some work we did as part of the Bridge Policy Initiative at West Virginia University. And what we did is we did a study using a number of different faculty at the institution. And we developed a policymaker's guide to talk about here are some of the potential solutions, natural climate solutions that we can implement in West Virginia. Here's the potential economic impact, and here's the potential job impact. And then also we developed some policy recommendations that may help grease the wheels to make this a reality. And so if you're in, I think I have if you're interested, the website is here. There's also a thing here, and I will provide a PDF of these so you can look at them later. You can go to the Bridge website, and this carbon dioxide removal policymakers guide is, you can just click it on a link. And what we did is we have we did this in like the traditional like National Academy of Sciences way. We had a policy question. So we had what actions, if any, should national, state, and local West Virginia policymakers take to enhance carbon dioxide removal in West Virginia and also increase economic opportunities and jobs. And so when we did this, our first thing we did is we felt that West Virginia was really great for 3 types of this carbon dioxide removal. So we have a lot of forests, we have some ag going on, we have a lot of pasture, kind of low-level pasture in West Virginia, and then there's also a lot of degraded wetlands and destroyed wetlands in West Virginia that could be restored. We also looked at some bioenergy carbon capture and storage in the state, and then we also looked at direct air capture. So it's a little hard to see, but there's also technology that's being developed right now where you would basically have an engineering process where air would go through something and the machine would suck the CO2 out of it. The problem with this right now is it's really energy intensive. So they're trying to balance it so that you're not emitting more carbon than you're actually sucking out of the air. And the one good thing about West Virginia is for all of these solutions, we have a lot of geologic storage because we have these we have natural gas in the state. We have the geologic formations where we can pump carbon dioxide underground and it would stay for a long time. And West Virginia is also a 75% forest state. We have a lot of forests that we can manage to store more carbon dioxide. And so here is just looking at the potential for some of these natural climate solutions in West Virginia. Over here is, so this is, I know it's hard to see from the way back. This green one right here, that's forest. They're taking up a lot of carbon in West Virginia right now. That's the gist of that. And we also have some wetlands, but they're mostly degraded. They're not taking up as much. If we manage our forests better, we can almost capture an additional 20 to 30% of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If we manage our agriculture ecosystems better, we can also suck up some more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then you might think that abandoned mineland restoration in West Virginia would be this great way to solve climate change, but there's actually not that many abandoned. If you think about the number of abandoned minelands in the state, it's not that much land area. You know, if you had the square of this table, the abandoned minelands would be like that corner. So if you plant trees there, it's a good thing, but it's not going to store that much carbon. We also looked at if you did bioenergy carbon capture and storage, what was the potential for that? And I'm going to skip through that because you can't see it anyway. And we also looked at which ones were the cheapest and which ones were the most costly. And we had these key findings and recommendations. So one was to create carbon reduction opportunities in West Virginia, restore carbon in West Virginia's natural resources, benefit West Virginia's economic prosperity and create jobs for West Virginians, open CDR opportunities while protecting West Virginia's ecology, conservation, economy, and the environment, and also nurture West Virginia's disadvantaged communities. So a lot of our efforts also focused on trying to locate some of these in the southern part of the state where they have a lot of economic disadvantages. And when we looked at all of these, there was really a potential for anywhere between, there's a wide range of estimates, but you're looking anywhere between, $100 million to almost $1 billion that we can put into this. And this is small too, I apologize. It also creates jobs. We had the economists at the business school, they went through and cooked the books, and we could calculate how many jobs you could have if you promoted this carbon dioxide removal in the state. So some of our policy recommendations for natural climate solutions, one was so if you go out, one of my colleagues in forestry surveyed forest landowners in West Virginia and asked them if they knew about carbon credits. And almost none of them knew about it. Even though, I don't know if anybody's seen the Family Forest Carbon Program billboards on the highway. They had one in '68 outside Morgantown. I don't know if they have them up here. This program is also operating in Pittsburgh. But folks don't really know, they don't know about it. They don't know that it's an opportunity. And so one of the ideas we're trying to, we're also going to go back and resurvey these landowners and see what are the barriers for you to get into this. Is it a monetary incentive that would help you, some initial help with the upfront costs? What's going to get you into these markets to help manage our forests better for carbon? And one thing here is this map that you're looking at is showing you, this is West Virginia, and you can see that there's a lot of corporate forest land holdings, but the vast majority of forests in West Virginia is actually owned by normal people. And so trying to get those normal people into this economic opportunity is really important. One kind of stickler on this has been the forest products industry in the state. So they're worried that if you tell people to do these forest carbon credit projects, they're not going to timber their land as much, they're not going to have as much wood to access, and they're going to lose out. And so one way to get them to buy in is if they don't actually get a monetary incentive for taking that wood and selling it to somebody so they can make a share. And so thinking about incentivizing the forest products industry to be on board with this as well. And then there's nothing like a good tax credit to get people on board. So we also recommended that right now there's a federal tax credit for technology carbon dioxide removal, so those things like those direct air capture machines, or also that carbon capture and storage from the coal plant. There's actually not a tax credit for natural climate solutions. And then the last couple of recommendations we had really focused on, we need to be able to measure, monitor, and verify these things better. So all in all, I think for me, the thing I think about is West Virginia was a leader in emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but we also have the potential to be a leader in sticking it back into the ground. I think that's a really important thing. And one thing that I think is also really important in these efforts is that you need to do it equitably, because all the coal money that went on, it didn't benefit all the everyday West Virginians. A lot of that money left the state. And now we have the opportunity to keep that money in the state and also benefit the environment as well. And so, before I end here, I just want to talk about some past environmental successes. We've figured out big problems before. We were able to get our lawmakers on board. We were able to get other countries on board. And so this is just an animation of the ozone layer with and without the Montreal Protocol. So back in the 90s, we knew the ozone hole was a problem. We knew CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, were causing that hole. And Congress, the countries, everybody got involved. We actually ratified a treaty through the Senate, and we reduced chlorofluorocarbons. And it led to a restoration of the ozone hole, so we don't have to worry about harmful UV rays and all that other fun stuff that could have happened to us. Another past environmental success is the Clean Air Act. So right here in Wheeling, West Virginia, I think it was in 1980, there's something that like the pH of rain here was around 1, right? And that is like, so Bill Peterjohn, who talked to you before, he likes to say that that was Mother Nature throwing up on Wheeling, West Virginia, because it's basically stomach acid. And so what happened is scientists sounded the alarm. They saw that lakes were being acidified, rainwater was being acidified, forests were being damaged, aquatic life in waterways was being damaged. And Congress acted, they passed the Clean Air Act. So what that did is it reduced sulfur and nitrogen emissions from coal-fired power plants. And because when the sulfur and nitrogen went in the air, it made sulfuric acid and nitric acid that rained down onto ecosystems. And so the Clean Air Act took care of that by using a cap and trade system, where they had a cap on emissions, and then every company got so much that they could emit. If they didn't emit it, they could trade or sell their allowable emissions to another company, and they kept lowering and lowering the cap. And when this was going through, guess what industry said? It's going to kill us. We're not going to be able to make any money. We're all going to be poor. The economy is going to be destroyed. Well, that wasn't the case. It was actually really cheap. This is a graph of showing you U.S. global domestic products, and here is showing you the reduction in all. This is the, right here is 1. So you can see that for some of these pollutants, like lead, we had almost 100% reduction. Sulfur and nitrogen, we had almost a 50 to 60% reduction in atmospheric concentrations of those. So it worked. And Republicans and Democrats both voted for that thing to go through. And now the pH of rain is now 1 in Wheeling, West Virginia. And then I'll end with this last little environmental success. So does anybody remember when they were at school when they taught you about Thomas Malthus? So he's the guy who said, we're not going to be able to feed everybody, we're all going to die, we're going to not have enough food. Well, we figured that out. So 2 German scientists back in World War I figured out how to make people from air. And they weren't trying to make people from air, they were actually trying to make bombs. So this was Haber and Bosch, and what they did is the Germans did not have access to guano deposits to get nitrogen so that they could make TNT. And so Haber and Bosch figured out how to take the nitrogen that is in the air. So nitrogen is triple bonded together. And they figured out an industrial process to break that triple bond, which takes a lot of energy, and make fertilizer or bombs. And so you can see that when that occurred, this led to the Green Revolution, where we started to have the ability to feed more and more people on the planet. And that increase in population isn't just due to the Green Revolution, but there's estimates that there's an extra 2 to 3 billion people on the planet because we figured out how to make food from air. Now, there's also a cautionary tale in this, in that it also has led to too much nitrogen going onto ecosystems and leading to water quality problems. But like any solution, there's always a little bit of a problem. And then hopefully we don't have to do this stuff. So our options of last resort are geoengineering solutions. And you'll see on this graph that some of the geoengineering solutions are things that I talked about, but I don't think those are at the scale of some of these other ones. So does anybody remember when Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted? So that led to global cooling. It led to the Earth being like a ½ degree Celsius cooler than it was for a couple of years. And what this was due to is that the volcano injects a lot of sulfur particles into the atmosphere. And so if we wanted to, we could reduce climate warming by injecting sulfur particles into the atmosphere. The problem with that is it could screw with rainfall patterns, particularly in places like India that rely on the monsoon. It might cripple the Indian monsoon, leading to a massive hit. So that's a problem. The other thing we could do is, you can see things like space mirrors. So we would have things in the upper atmosphere that would reflect some of the sunlight back out. So we wouldn't be receiving as much heat from the sun. And so it would cool us, but there's still one sticky problem with that as well, in that the ocean sucks up a lot of carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide acidifies the ocean, because carbon dioxide makes carbonic acid when it mixes with water. And so you would solve the climate problem, but then you'd have an ocean biological catastrophe. You'd have more coral reef bleaching, and potentially you could lead to a collapse of those ecosystems. And similarly, there's things like cloud seeding. There was a scientist back in the 1980s who said that if you gave him a tanker full of iron, he could solve climate change, because a lot of the world's oceans are limited by iron concentration. So if you give them iron, they grow faster, so the phytoplankton. And so people tested this. There's a little bit of a problem because you get this plankton bloom, but then it doesn't make it, all the things eat it and recycle it, and it doesn't go down the sink to the bottom. So there are fallback plans, but a lot of these are not good. They will work, but we don't know what the unintended consequences are. All right, so I try not to be doom and gloom. Hopefully I wasn't too doom and gloom. All right, so the first positive take home is that we have all the tools at our disposal to bend the curve and slow climate change. We just need the will. And there's a lot of, I didn't give you the direct number, but there's a lot of people who have done estimates that have shown that if we start doing something now, it's going to be a lot cheaper than if we start doing something later. Right? It's just kicking that thing down the road where it's going to cost you a whole hell of a lot of money. Because you're going to have to start thinking about how are you going to adapt cities to rising sea level? How are you going to adapt cities to warmer temperatures, less water? If we started now, we can reduce that economic pain. And that's why a lot of corporations see this, and they're realizing that they need to protect their supply chains, and they need to decarbonize their supply chains. And then, I know I said all these uncertainties with a lot of these natural climate solutions, but if you do these things, they also have other important benefits. So a lot of these will increase biodiversity. A lot of these will increase water quality. A lot of these will lead to local cooling. You have more trees in a city, it's cooler. So even though you might not get the carbon benefit, you realize there's nothing wrong with managing natural ecosystems like forests or agricultural ecosystems better And it's a win-win even if you don't get the carbon you think you're going to get out of it. And then finally, I think, I showed some of those recommendations, but I think West Virginia really has the potential. We can get these green jobs in the state. We have places where you can stick a direct air capture facility in the southern part of the state because you have the geologic storage there to pump the CO2 underground. There's also talk of putting a hydrogen hub up in this area so that they would generate hydrogen fuels, and then they would take the byproducts of natural gas and pump that CO2 underground so it would be carbon neutral. So there are some economic opportunities for West Virginia in this. All right, and I think I went a little long, and I apologize. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the Bridge Initiative. I'd like to acknowledge the CABI, the Center for Advanced Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation. I'd like to thank the DOE for giving me money. And then this is just a picture of I'd also like to thank my lab who do a lot of this work that we do. And so this is a picture we took of us after we dug a hole. We were trying to measure carbon down to a meter squared. My students, before we did this, so they went out 1 week and then I came out the second week. And the week I wasn't there, it was 100 degrees. And the week I showed up, it was 75. I was like, this is easy. And they're like, no. So everything I do, they're really helpful in doing that. And then just put these positive take-homes up, and then I'll just one more doom and gloom. This is the picture of the July air temperature anomaly, with July being the hottest month on record since for 83 years that we've had these records. So it's time to do something. All right, thank you.
Yes, question?
Yes, go for it.
I'm interested in methane, and it sounds like how flatulence and burps we're getting some. I assume that that's not a very large part of the problem. Is that?
So methane is a big problem. So you have the cows. You also have rice production is really bad for producing methane because methane likes an environment with no oxygen. So an environment with no oxygen is a cow's gut. An environment with no oxygen is a rice paddy. And so the thing about methane is it's 16 times better at reflecting infrared light back down to the earth. Because methane is a carbon with 4 hydrogens around it. And so it has 4 bonds that can reflect infrared light. CO2 only has 2.
Okay, so it's really bad. But for instance, in a landfill, an abandoned or a finished landfill that's covered, I have seen pipes going in to capture the methane. So there must be some value to the methane as a fuel or something.
Yeah, so I don't know. So in our so what a lot of landfills do is sometimes they'll have a power plant associated with it, or they'll also just burn the methane because it's better to burn the methane and make carbon dioxide than to let the methane go in the atmosphere. So our sewage treatment plant in Morgantown, you'll see a lot of times there's this pipe and there's just a big flare of fire coming off of it. And what they're doing is they're burning the methane because the methane is such a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is.
So then it turns into a fuel, basically.
Yeah.
So is there any value to capturing the carbon dioxide that you have put into the soil? Is there any use for that?
So are you talking about like I burn methane and then I have the carbon dioxide there?
No. You're sequestering that carbon dioxide down in a pit.
Yep.
Okay. Do you want to put a pipe in there to capture it for some reason?
So what we want to do is keep it there.
Okay.
But there's also folks who are looking at other efforts to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and make products.
That's my question.
Yeah, so I will say do folks watch PBS and Nova? There's a really good one. They did a documentary. I think it's, I'll find the name and I'll forward it to Sean when I send the slides. But it's really good, and they talk about some of these efforts to take carbon dioxide from a direct air capture plant, or from a coal-fired power plant and make products. They're not scalable yet. So all these things I talked about, you can scale. Those aren't scalable. Yep. Yep.
Can I just ask a question? Because you'll probably know, say if you happen to look it up. You mentioned that like the sequestering of carbon is small compared to like how much carbon we're putting out there. Do you know offhand like the amount of carbon that the trees in West Virginia sequester every year? Even with a 20% increase, say, if we manage them well. How does that compare to the amount of carbon that we're putting into the universe by fossil fuels mined here in West Virginia?
Yep.
Like, do you have to look up that number or have it?
So actually on here it has a number. So this number right here is 12 million metric tons of carbon dioxide.
And
Trees are taking up on an annual basis in West Virginia. Humans, I can't remember what a petagram is, but humans put 8 petagrams of carbon in. There's a lot more zeros than a million. I think it might be 10 to the 16th, so I think there's 16 zeros after that.
But that's the whole humanity.
That's all of humanity.
So we'd have to look and see what West Virginia's contribution is.
Yes.
Okay.
So if you, so you probably saw this graph, but if you look at what we emit, right? We emit around 8 petagrams of carbon. About 30% of that goes in the ocean, another 30% of that goes into the land, and the other 30% just stays in the atmosphere. So we're lucky that the ecosystems are kind of buffering this for us, but we don't know how long that's going to keep going on. Yep.
Just thank you, because it's nice to know that you guys are doing something, you know what I mean? But my question is, the businesses that are running everything, they're not making money off of the fossil fuel. How cooperative are they going to be to make sure that there's a decrease in it? Because once the dollar bill gets in there, they don't care.
So all the big oil corporations are investing in carbon capture strategies.
Really?
So I'm involved with that research at the University of Illinois. Before the DOE guy came in and funded them, British Petroleum BP was funding them to look at bioenergy. Exxon has things. It's sort of like the cigarette companies.
Yeah.
They were lying to you and telling you that CO2 and climate change wasn't a problem. But now they can't lie anymore, and so they're going to try to make sure they can protect themselves and make some money off the solution. Yes.
I raised this question last week, so I hope I don't bore anybody with it, but I've been following the work of Olivia Lazard, and she mentioned the importance, and I believe you showed it here tonight. I haven't seen the article yet. The 2020 are these areas that bring these back regeneratively. Are these the first? It's not going to include removing currently what our battery technologies are, or storage and EVs. But these are kind of like, these places are not extractable. You can't take things out of them. They're so important to the overall climate, where if we keep those things safeguarded, whether it be like the Congo Basin, let's say, and we keep that vital place, and you don't even look at the conflicts that are going to be taking place with the material resources. Her analogy is to keep that place pristine based on what their research was. I just wondered if that would be a starting point to look forward.
So places we want to conserve or
Conserve, yeah, based on building our new infrastructure of the previous conflict.
Yeah, so obviously that's important. It's important to protect the Amazon rainforest, the Congo River Basin, the tropics in Asia. The issue is an economic one, though. Yeah. So that's a lot of the discussions at these UN, at the Paris Agreement, at the recent meeting in Glasgow, have made a lot of money and advanced their prosperity by burning fossil fuels to help out the countries that aren't going to be able to do that. And so there's talks of how do we get them the money to protect those lands, because you don't want to say to folks in Africa, well, sorry, we put all the CO2 in the atmosphere, you can't develop economically.
Right.
So there has to be an economic incentive and an agreement to help those countries out.
She made another point where she was concerned that the IPCC wasn't overly concerned about the regenerative process as much as it should be concerned. I mean, that's kind of what you're talking about.
So the regenerate, like
Yeah, it wasn't
reforestation.
part of policy decision making, at least with the current iteration that I was speaking for. Meaning that it needs to be emphasized.
So reforestation. And
Yes, all that needs to be brought up.
I think it's because you can make an estimate, so you can make that map and say I can store 200 gigatons of carbon. But the issue is you have to realize that, and there's money, there's actually occurring, and there are folks who are going out and planting trees.
Yep. It is, it's kind of an addendum to what the gentleman talked about a little bit ago. If West Virginia is so rich in the forest side of things, the carbon capture and that piece, where people will say that, yeah, electric vehicles are essentially using fossil fuels to power at least a percentage of what they're storing in their batteries. You can also say in the same argument, yeah, we have a lot more forest in this area that can pull that same carbon in.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of a win-win there. Yeah. Because our grid's broken up in at least 3 sections. So we're the dirty side of the country getting most of our energy from fossil fuels. We also have the carbon ability to pull some of it back in.
Yeah, but you still got to think about it's never going to get you all of it.
No, it's not going to, but it's better than some states don't have that rich infrastructure, the natural infrastructure.
You have a question?
So you mentioned at one point that carbon capture sequestration technologies have governmental support, like forestation strategies in West Virginia.
Well, in fact, so there's a tax credit at the federal level for technical solutions, not natural solutions.
At the federal level.
Yes.
So is there discussion about reforestation, supporting reforestation, or not really?
So I don't know all the particulars of this, but the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of climate mitigation language in it, and so the Forest Service, the USDA, they're all getting a lot of money to look into managing systems to store more carbon naturally. In West Virginia, we actually went down and talked to some of the lawmakers because they were thinking about putting a hardcore ban on any carbon credit projects in West Virginia because they were told that if you had a carbon credit project, you couldn't log your land, which is not true. And they are also worried, rightly, because of the projects that have come in. I told you 28 million carbon credits have been issued in the state, and most of those have went to large corporations, just like all the coal money went to. And they didn't know what's going on, and a lot of those are 100-year agreements. And so the legislature is worried about locking up land in 100-year agreements. That small family forest owner program is only 40-year agreements. So they're still debating this. We went down and talked to them. They're very pleasant. We educated them. I don't know if what we talked about got through.
How many years did you say that the small family one was?
It's 40 years. There was a kind of a snake oil carbon credit one where they would give you money for not cutting your land for 1 year. They went out of business, thankfully. All right. Well, thanks everyone.